You know, they say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes blood can poison everything it touches. I learned that lesson the hard way on a Tuesday evening in October when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air had that crisp bite. That promises winter is coming. My name is Alex, and I need to tell you about the night my family showed me exactly who they really were. The night I discovered that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who'll hurt you the deepest. But this isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about what happens when the underdog finally finds their teeth. I'd been planning this dinner for weeks. My partner Sam and I had been together for 3 years, and somehow I'd managed to keep them away from my family for most of that time. It wasn't intentional at first, but my family has this way of making everything about them, of sucking the oxygen out of any room they enter. They're loud, they're judgmental, and they have opinions about everything, especially about me. Growing up, I was the disappointment, the quiet one, the one who preferred books to sports, who asked too many questions, who never quite fit into the mold they'd carved out for me. My older brother Marcus was the golden child star athlete, class president, everything I wasn't. My sister Elena was the princess, beautiful and charming and capable of wrapping anyone around her little finger. And then there was me, Alex, the afterthought, the one they'd shake their heads at and say, well, at least you're trying. But Sam changed everything. Sam saw something in me that my family never did. Sam made me feel like I mattered, like my thoughts and dreams and ambitions were worth something. We built a life together, a real life with inside jokes and shared goals and quiet Sunday mornings where we dread the paper together and plan our future. The irony is that while my family was busy dismissing me, I was busy building something they never saw coming. You see, I'd always been good with numbers, good with patterns, good with seeing opportunities where others saw problems. While they were focused on their own drama, I was quietly investing, building, creating. The trust fund my grandfather left me, the one they'd all forgotten about because I never talked about money, never flaunted it, I'd turned it into something substantial. I'd started a consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses optimize their operations. It grew slowly at first, then faster, then exponentially, but I never told them. Why would I? They'd made it clear that my worth wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in whether I could live up to their expectations. And I'd learned long ago that I never would. So when I finally decided to bring Sam to the annual family dinner, it felt like a test, not for Sam, but for them. I wanted to see if they could accept the person I'd become, the love I'd found, the happiness I'd built without their approval or input. The dinner was at my parents' house, the same house where I'd grown up feeling like a stranger in my own home. The dining room with its heavy oak table and formal china, the living room with its uncomfortable furniture that was more for show than for sitting, everything exactly as I remembered it, down to the way the light from the chandelier cast shadows. That made everyone look harsh and angular. I introduced Sam to everyone, and at first things seemed normal. Normal for my family anyway, which meant a lot of small talk and passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. Oh, Alex finally brought someone home, my mother said with that smile that never reached her eyes. How long have you two been seeing each other? 3 years, I said, and I watched her eyebrows rise slightly as if she was surprised I'd managed to keep anyone interested for that long. Sam was perfect, charming without being fake, interested without being pushy, respectful without being intimidated. They asked my father about his work, complimented my mother on the meal, laughed at Marcus's jokes, and even managed to find common ground with Elena about some book they'd both read. For a moment, I let myself hope maybe this would be different. Maybe they'd see what I saw in Sam, maybe they'd finally see me as someone worth loving. But then Uncle Richard arrived. Uncle Richard is my father's older brother, and he's never met an opinion he didn't want to share or a boundary he didn't want to cross. He's the kind of man who thinks volume equals authority, who believes that his age gives him the right to say whatever he wants without consequences. He walked into that dining room like he owned it, his voice booming across the space before he'd even taken his coat off. Well, 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 he said, looking around the room until his eyes landed on Sam. And who might this be? I made the introduction, my stomach already tightening with a familiar dread. There was something in his tone, something in the way he was looking at Sam, that made my skin crawl. Sam, this is my Uncle Richard. Uncle Richard, this is Sam, my partner. The word partner hung in the air like a challenge. I saw Uncle Richard's jaw tighten, saw the way his eyes narrowed slightly, and then he smiled, and I knew we were in trouble. Partner, he repeated, as if the word tasted bad in his mouth. Well, isn't that modern? The room went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of people enjoying a meal, but the tense electric quiet that comes before a storm. I could feel Sam's hand tighten slightly on mine under the table. Richard, my mother said in a warning tone, but he waved her off. No, no, I think we need to address this. This is a family dinner, isn't it? A family gathering, and I'm sorry, but I don't think your friend should be here. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt Sam's hand slip away from mine, felt them shift slightly in their chair. The shame burned hot in my chest, but underneath it was something else, something colder and more dangerous. Sam is my partner, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. They're part of my family. Uncle Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Family. Alex, you've always been confused about what family means. This person is not family. This person doesn't belong here. I looked around the room, waiting for someone to speak up, waiting for my parents to defend me, for Marcus to tell Uncle Richard he was out of line, for Elena to use that charm of hers to diffuse the situation. But they all just sat there, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. Their silence was deafening. I think, Uncle Richard continued, warming to his theme, that you should ask your friend to leave. This is a family dinner, and we don't need outsiders here, making things awkward. The heat in my chest was spreading now, up my neck, across my face. But I kept my voice level, kept my expression neutral. Sam is not leaving, I said. Sam is welcome here, not by me, Uncle Richard shot back, and I think I speak for everyone when I say that we'd prefer to keep this evening traditional. That's when I looked around the room again, really looked. At my parents, who were staring at their plates, at Marcus, who was suddenly very interested in his wine glass, at Elena, who was fidgeting with her napkin. None of them would meet my eyes. Does anyone else have something to say? I asked, and my voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, and in that silence I heard everything I needed to know. I heard 30 years of being dismissed, of being tolerated, of being told I wasn't enough. I heard the truth that I'd been trying to ignore my whole life. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Sam looked up at me, confusion and hurt and anger warring in their eyes. You're right, Uncle Richard, I said, and I saw surprise flicker across his face. This is a family dinner, and family should be the people who stand by you, who support you, who love you unconditionally. Since Sam is the only person in this room who's ever done that for me, I think you're right. We should go. I helped Sam up from their chair, their hand trembling slightly in mine. We walked to the entryway together, and I could hear the murmur of voices starting up behind us, but I didn't turn around. I didn't look back. Sam was quiet on the drive home, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. When we finally got to our apartment, they turned to me with tears in their eyes. I'm sorry, they said. I'm so sorry that happened to you, to me, I said, taking their hands in mine. Sam, they insulted you. They made you feel unwelcome in your own partner's family home. I should be the one apologizing. But they're your family, Sam said, and their voice broke a little on the words. I know how much that meant to you, bringing me to meet them. I know you wanted their approval. I pulled Sam close, held them against my chest while they cried for the family I'd never really had. And while I comforted them, while I whispered reassurances and promises that we'd be okay, something was hardening inside me, something cold and calculating and final. I spent the next week thinking about that dinner, about the silence that had followed Uncle Richard's words about the way my family had shown me exactly where I stood in their hierarchy of love and loyalty. I thought about Sam's tears, about the humiliation we'd both endured, about the way my heart had broken not just for myself but for the person I loved most in the world, and then I started making phone calls. You see, what my family didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was exactly how successful my consulting firm had become. They didn't know that I'd expanded into investment management, that I'd built a portfolio of properties and businesses that generated more money in a month than most people see in a year. They didn't know that when my grandfather had left me that trust fund, I'd turned it into something that would have made him proud. They also didn't know that over the years, as they'd struggled with various financial challenges, I'd been the one quietly helping them out. When my parents needed to refinance their mortgage, I'd co-signed the loan. When Marcus's business was failing, I'd invested in it to keep it afloat. When Elena's husband lost his job, I'd made sure their family had what they needed to get by. I'd done it all anonymously through lawyers and shell companies because I knew that if they knew the money was coming from me, they'd either refuse it out of pride or take it as evidence that I was finally being useful for something. Either way, they'd have made it about them, about their needs and their feelings and their opinions about how I should live my life. But now, sitting in my office, the Monday after that dinner, I started calling in those debts. I started exercising rights and privileges that I'd never used before. I started showing them exactly what family loyalty looked like when it was withdrawn. The first call was to my parents' mortgage company. As a co-signer, I had certain rights and I exercised them. I called in the loan, demanded immediate payment, and when they couldn't provide it, I initiated foreclosure proceedings. The second call was to Marcus's business partner. I owned 60% of their company, and I invoked my right as majority shareholder to dissolve the partnership. His business, the one he'd built his entire identity around, ceased to exist with a single phone call. The third call was to Elena's landlord. I owned the building where she lived, had bought it years ago as an investment property. I gave her 30 days notice to vacate, and Uncle Richard's retirement fund was invested through a firm I'd acquired 2 years earlier. I transferred his portfolio to a series of high-risk investments that would at best break even and at worst cost him everything. I didn't do any of this out of anger, although I was angry. I didn't do it for revenge, although there was satisfaction in it. I did it because they'd shown me that family was conditional, that love had limits, that acceptance came with terms and conditions I'd never be able to meet. So I removed myself from the equation entirely. The calls started coming in within a week. First, my mother, panicked and confused about the foreclosure notice. Then Marcus, desperate and angry about his business. Then Elena, crying about having to find a new place to live. And finally, Uncle Richard, who'd apparently figured out that his financial troubles weren't a coincidence. I didn't answer any of them. I let them go to voicemail, let them pile up like evidence of exactly how much they'd taken me for granted. When the messages became increasingly frantic, increasingly desperate, I had my lawyer send a single letter to each of them. It was short and to the point. All financial arrangements between Alex and your family have been terminated. Please direct any future correspondence through legal channels. No further contact will be acknowledged or responded to. The silence that followed was different from the silence at that dinner. This silence was mine. This silence was my choice. This silence was power. Sam was worried about me at first. They'd seen me make those phone calls, seen the cold efficiency with which I'd dismantled everything I'd built for my family. They were afraid I was becoming someone they didn't recognize, someone hard and cruel and vindictive, but I wasn't becoming someone new. I was finally becoming myself. For the first time in my life, I was setting boundaries that couldn't be crossed, establishing worth that couldn't be diminished, creating a space where love was unconditional and respect was given freely. It took 6 months for my family to realize that I wasn't coming back. 6 months of increasingly desperate attempts to reach me, to explain themselves, to make amends. 6 months of discovering exactly how much they'd depended on me, how much they'd taken for granted, how much they'd underestimated the quiet kid who never quite fit in. My father was the first to understand. He called me at work, somehow managing to get through to my direct line despite the instructions I'd given my assistant. His voice was different when he spoke, older somehow, more tired. "Alex," he said, and I could hear the weight of everything unsaid in that single word. "I know you don't want to talk to us, and I understand why. But I need you to know that what happened at dinner, that wasn't right. We should have stood up for you. We should have stood up for Sam. We should have been better." I listened to him talk for 10 minutes, heard him take responsibility in a way he'd never done before, heard him acknowledge things he'd never been willing to see, and when he was finished, when he'd said everything he needed to say, I spoke for the first time in 6 months. "Dad," I said, and my voice was steady and calm and sure, "I appreciate the apology. I really do. But apologies don't undo silence. They don't undo 30 years of making me feel like I had to earn my place in my own family. They don't undo the fact that when it mattered most, when I needed you to choose between me and Uncle Richard's bigotry, you chose silence." "Alex, please," he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "We're family. We can work through this." "No, Dad," I said. "Family doesn't work the way you think it does. Family isn't about blood or obligation or tradition. Family is about showing up. Family is about standing by each other when it's hard. Family is about love without conditions, and that's not what you gave me." I hung up the phone, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace that evening. I went home to Sam, to the life we'd built together, to the family we'd chosen. Sam was in the kitchen, making dinner, humming softly to themselves. They looked up when I walked in, and their face lit up with the kind of smile that made everything else fade away. "How was your day?" they asked, and I kissed them instead of answering, kissed them the way I should have kissed them that night at dinner, in front of everyone, without shame or hesitation or fear. "Better now," I said, and I meant it. We ate dinner together, talked about our days, made plans for the weekend. Normal things, domestic things, the kind of things that my family had never valued but that I'd learned were the foundation of real love. And later, as we sat together on the couch, Sam's head on my shoulder, I felt something I'd never felt before in my life. I felt like I was home. The final chapter of this story came a year later at the opening of my newest business venture. I'd started a foundation that provided financial support to LGBTQ plus youth who'd been rejected by their families. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it felt right, felt like a way to turn my pain into something useful. The opening was a big event, covered by the local news, attended by politicians and business leaders and community activists. I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and I talked about the importance of chosen family, about the courage it takes to build a life on your own terms, about the difference between being tolerated and being truly accepted, and in the back of the room I saw them. My parents, Marcus, Elena, even Uncle Richard. They'd come to see what I'd built, to witness the success they'd never believed I was capable of. They stood together, a family unit that I was no longer part of, watching me claim a space in the world that had nothing to do with them. After the speech, after the applause and the congratulations and the photos, my mother approached me. She looked older, more fragile than I remembered, and there were tears in her eyes. "Alex," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper, "I'm so proud of you." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd given me life but had never really known me, who'd loved me in her own limited way but had never fought for me when it mattered. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, "but I'm not doing this for your pride. I'm doing this because it's right, because no one should have to choose between their family and their authentic self, because love shouldn't have conditions." She nodded, understanding perhaps for the first time what she'd lost, what they'd all lost when they chose silence over support, tradition over truth, comfort over courage. "Is there any chance?" she asked, and her voice broke a little. "Any chance we could try again, could start over. I looked past her to where Sam was standing, surrounded by friends and colleagues and chosen family, radiant with happiness and pride. I looked at the life we'd built, the love we'd found, the future we were creating together, and I looked back. At my mother, at the hope and regret and desperate love in her eyes. I don't know, I said, and it was the most honest thing I'd ever said to her. I don't know if I can trust you to stand by me when it matters. I don't know if you can love me without trying to change me. I don't know if we can build something real from the ashes of what we had. She nodded again, tears flowing freely now. I understand, she said, but if you ever decide you want to try, we'll be here, we'll be waiting. I watched her walk away, watched her rejoin my father and my siblings, watched them leave together, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not anger, not satisfaction, not even sadness. I felt closure. That night, Sam and I celebrated with champagne and takeout Chinese food, curled up on our couch, talking about the future. We talked about marriage, about maybe buying a house, about the foundation and its mission and the lives we might be able to change. Do you think you'll ever forgive them? Sam asked, and I considered the question seriously. I don't know, I said. Forgiveness isn't something you do once and then it's done. It's something you choose every day. And right now, I'm choosing to focus on the future instead of the past. I'm choosing us instead of them. I'm choosing love instead of obligation. Sam smiled and kissed me, and in that kiss I tasted everything we'd built together, everything we'd overcome, everything we still had to look forward to. I love you, Sam said, and the words settled into my heart like a promise, like a prayer, like the kind of truth that doesn't need to be earned or qualified or defended. I love you too, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Outside, the city hummed with life and possibility. Somewhere across town, my family was probably sitting around a dinner table, talking about the evening, about me, about the choices they'd made and the consequences they were living with. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about the morning, about the work we'd do together, about the life we were building one day at a time. They'd always said I'd never amount to anything, that I'd never be worth the trouble, that I'd never find anyone who could love me the way I was. They were wrong about everything except the last part. I didn't find someone who could love me the way I was. I found someone who helped me become who I was meant to be, and that I realized was worth more than all the family approval in the world. The foundation thrived. Sam and I got married the following spring in a ceremony surrounded by friends and chosen family, people who loved us not in spite of who we were, but because of who we were. We bought a house with a garden and a spare room that we turned into an office, and sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings, we'd sit together and plan the future, and I'd think about how different my life was from what I'd imagined it would be. I never did answer those calls from my family. I never did try to rebuild what we'd lost. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because I'd learned something important about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between loving someone and letting them back into your life. I forgave them eventually. I forgave them because carrying anger is exhausting, because resentment is a poison that hurts the person holding it more than the person it's aimed at. I forgave them because I understood that they were products of their own upbringing, their own fears, their own limited understanding of what love could look like. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending that what happened didn't matter. It didn't mean opening my life back up to people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my heart. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd reacted differently that night. If I'd yelled at Uncle Richard, if I'd demanded that my family choose sides, if I'd made a scene and stormed out in a rage, would they have learned the same lesson? Would I have found the same peace? I don't think so. I think the quiet way I handled it, the methodical way I removed myself from their lives, the way I let actions speak louder than words, was exactly what they needed to understand the magnitude of what they'd lost. It was exactly what I needed to understand my own worth. The truth is, they were right about one thing. I was different. I was quieter, more thoughtful, more sensitive than they were. I did ask difficult questions. I did challenge assumptions. I did refuse to fit into the mold they'd created for me. But what they saw as weaknesses were actually my greatest strengths. My sensitivity made me a better partner, a better friend, a better advocate for people who needed someone to fight for them. My questioning nature made me a better businessman, a better problem solver, a better leader. My refusal to conform made me authentic, made me real, made me someone worth loving. It took me 30 years to learn that lesson, but once I learned it, everything changed. I stopped seeking approval from people who were never going to give it. I stopped trying to earn love from people who saw love as something that had to be earned. I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't in order to make other people comfortable. And in the space that created, in the silence that followed, I found something I'd been searching for my whole life without even knowing it. I found myself. I found my voice. I found my power. They said I'd always be worthless, but I let my work speak instead. My work in building a life that mattered, a love that lasted, a legacy that would outlive all of us. My work in creating something beautiful from the ashes of what they'd destroyed, and in the end, that work spoke louder than any words they'd ever said about me, louder than any doubts they'd ever planted in my mind, louder than any silence they'd ever used to diminish me. In the end, my work spoke the truth they'd never been able to hear, that I was worth loving, worth fighting for, worth standing by. And the people who really mattered, the people who became my real family, heard that truth loud and clear. That's the story I needed to tell you, not just about betrayal and revenge and family drama, but about the moment when you realize that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally have been loving you with more conditions than you ever imagined. About the moment when you decide that their conditions don't define your worth, about the moment when you choose to walk away from the table where you're not being fed and build your own table where everyone has a seat. It's about the moment when you realize that family isn't about who you're related to, but about who shows up for you when it matters. It's about the moment when you understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Sometimes the most devastating response to cruelty is dignity. Sometimes the most effective way to show people what they've lost is to simply quietly walk away, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, you walk away into the arms of someone who's been waiting for you all along, someone who sees you exactly as you are and loves you not despite your differences but because of them. That's the real victory in this story. Not the money I took back, not the businesses I destroyed, not the power I wielded. The real victory was the love I found, the family I chose, the life I built on my own terms. They said I'd always be worthless, but I let my work speak instead. And my work said something they never could, that I was worth everything.